What is kinesiology used for? And does it work? Is it valid? I'm going to give you just enough information and details so that you can make an informed decision for yourself. Coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg with Wellness for Life, and if you like to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure that you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. So kinesiology is simply the study of emotion, but what most people mean when they say kinesiology is applied kinesiology, or AK, or muscle testing. So that's what we're going to talk about, and that's what we use in our office. When we do a muscle test, then we typically start with an arm stretched out, we push on the bone is held up by a muscle, and the muscle is controlled by a signal from the brain. So we're really involving three different systems, the bone, muscle, and the brain. One is passive, one is active, but one is regulating. So the passive doesn't change, the active doesn't change, it's the regulating that changes. It's the brain processing, the signaling that changes. So it's really the brain that we're testing. Everything in your body is regulated by the brain. So here's the process. The body has receptors that send input, that send efferent information, incoming information to the brain, and then the brain processes that. So the combination of input and processing results in perception. So that incoming information gives the brain enough data to paint a picture of what the world looks like. The brain has never seen or heard or touched or felt anything, but with enough information, the brain can create a picture of the world. If that information coming in is correct, then the brain can paint a true picture and it can act properly. So then the brain processes and it creates an output, an afferent signal, so it can affect the body parts that need to do things. And then the body has receptors that give the brain more information, and so this wheel keeps spinning. And perception, or input, can come from three different big areas. One is chemical, one is mechanical or proprioception, and one is emotional. So all of these things can change how the brain processes and perceives things. So chemicals, if you put in chemicals or drugs or pesticides, or if you get food poisoning, those are all chemical inputs. So are hormones and neurotransmitters, etc. Mechanical and proprioception, that's movement. 90% of what your brain processes has to do with proprioception, meaning where are the body parts in relation to gravity and the environment. This is so important that is 90% of what the brain does, and things that don't move don't have brains. So the main purpose of the brain is to process information and proprioception so that you can figure out where you are and you can interact with your environment. And emotional, obviously, thoughts are real things. You can have a stressful thought and get goosebumps or high blood pressure or an ulcer and so forth. And this is a lot of information. The incoming information is somewhere around 1 billion bits of information per second. So that's a lot of stuff for the brain to process. And now if we understand this model, then the brain is really just a hub. It only does things based on information it receives. So it's really the incoming information that drives the system, and any change in the incoming information is going to create a change in the outgoing information. So that's what muscle testing is all about. We test, we push, we get a response, and if that response changes, it's because we changed the input. If that input is favorable, then in our experience, we get a locked muscle. If that input is unfavorable, we get an unlocked muscle. Okay? It's sort of intuitive. We can't prove that that's the case, that locked is good for the most part, and unlocked means that something is not helping the body. But from millions and millions of muscle tests and interactions and people getting better, it is our experience that that's the case. We want to think of the muscle test as a neurological reflex because we have information coming in, we have brain processing, and we have a response. And that response can be normal or abnormal. So in the case of muscle testing, the normal response is for that arm to lock. The abnormal is for it to unlock. For the most part, it depends on what we're looking at. And if you do a patella tendon reflex, if you have someone hit your kneecap with a little hammer, then the foot is going to kick out. That's a neurological reflex. Normally, that would only kick out once, but if there's something wrong with the brain, then it's going to result in hyperreflexia, and we get either an exaggerated response or multiple repeated responses. So just like there are abnormal neurological reflexes in neurology, there are also normal and abnormal findings in muscle testing. So the brain is what modulates and affects those things. So muscle testing is one of the most controversial topics out there, and for the most part it's because people don't understand it, or because they don't know how to do it properly, or they have unrealistic expectations. So let's look at a few things here. The proper way of doing a muscle test is to first understand that you're looking for a lock. It's not a strong or a weak muscle, it is a lock or an unlock. It's a yes or a no. It's not a grayscale of strong or weak. And that's a skill that you have to develop. It's an understanding. You probably have to push on a few thousand or tens of thousands of arms before you get really good, where you're sure that, yes, I know what a lock feels like. And in order to establish that lock, you need to have both the tester and the person being tested totally stable. So you can either have them standing, or you can have them sitting or laying down, but it has to be in a stable position. And then you want to use gradual pressure. So you start with an ounce of pressure. Over the course of a few seconds, you gradually increase to a couple of pounds. And during that, you sense if there is a change or if there is a rigid end feel to it. So by practicing that, you can tell if you have a lock or not. It is not about a strong versus a weak muscle. So I'm sorry if you've been exposed to some people who don't understand this, and I've seen some horrendous examples on YouTube. I don't know if I want to laugh or cry because it misleads people and it takes advantage of people. Like the stability portion, for example. Sometimes I see people test like this and they say, oh, stand on one leg, and then they push way out here and the person goes flying. It has nothing to do with a muscle test. That has to do with balance and vectors and what direction you apply the pressure. It's absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about. And the other thing is it has to be gradual. And very often I'll see testing where they go, oh, look here. And when they want to make it strong, they do it gradual. And when they want to show you how weak you went, then they do it super fast and you go flying again. So realize that you have to know what to do and be consistent to get consistent findings. And as good as this is, there are limitations, and we have to be aware of how to establish consistency, but we also have to understand what the limitations are. So the first limitation is bias. Because we are dealing with an information system and thoughts and emotions are part of this, then it is sometimes not entirely possible to eliminate all bias. That's why we don't use this as the single test. We use it as an adjunct, and we use it in cases where our bias is not very influential. So I'll give some examples of that. Then it depends on skill. And like I said, you might have to do this a few thousand times before you get reasonably good. And skill also involves understanding what we are looking for so that you put the patient in a consistent place, so that you know to look for a lock, that you don't change things up, that you understand that this is one test and this is another test and this is another test. So you have to be consistent to get consistent results. And then you want to know that there can be other interference. Like I said, we're dealing with information and we are changing with the muscle test. We are working through a system of mechanics and proprioception, but the body can also be influenced by chemicals and thoughts. So if they have an interference with some chemical or metal or pathogen in their body, in addition to what we might be testing, then that can throw off the results. And if we don't know how to eliminate and account for that, then we may not get valid readings. But if we do know how to account for those, then we can get very, very consistent and get very valid readings. So very often people who don't understand this, they'll say, oh, that stuff doesn't work. This is pseudoscience, or we haven't done any double-blind placebo-controlled trials or something like that. And that's their opinion of the validity. So we'll get to that next. But so far, everything that I have discussed is physiology. It is science. You can read about this stuff in books. You can verify this for yourself. You can educate yourself and understand that everything that I've said so far is simply about neurophysiology. It's about signals. It's about how the brain processes things. It's about the brain turning things on and off. So if you disagree with something so far, then you're just uninformed. The rest of it, however, gets into opinion and experience. So when people question the validity, then this is where they have a right to their opinion. And we also want to understand how can we use this so that it's consistent. And when I use this, I use it to test for toxicity and sensitivity, for deficiencies, and for subluxations. And some people also use it to test for emotional states and beliefs and so forth. I don't get into that because I think there are too many variables. I think there's too much emotional bias. I think there may have some validity for some people, but I think you want to be very, very careful, and I just stay away from that. Now, when we test for toxicity sensitivity, I am not diagnosing. I'm not saying that you have metals or chemicals in your body. I'm saying it appears your body has a reaction to something. Let's see if we can find something that makes it work better. And this is completely different. A blood test will test and see how much pesticide, how much metal, how much pathogen is in your bloodstream. It's an absolute measure. We don't do that. We don't diagnose. We're asking about the body's reaction. And then we're using that reaction to see if we can find something to reverse that finding. So that's very, very important to understand, that some people say, oh, this isn't valid because you can't diagnose. They believe that we use this for diagnosing, and we don't. We absolutely don't, and we don't want to. So let me give you some examples of ways that I use this. So for example, the infraspinatus is a muscle in the rotator cuff. So if you push down here while you stabilize here, then you're testing the external rotator of the shoulder. And that's the most common weak muscle that I've ever found. More than half the people coming through the office probably have that one weak. And then what we have found is that through AK, through people collaborating, they have found that there are certain reflex points and there are certain organ relations, and that muscle most commonly relates to the immune system. So again, we don't diagnose, we're not saying you have an immune deficiency, we don't say that you have a disease, but we pick an immune support product and we see if it reverses that finding. And we don't care if you have an immune deficiency or not. We just found something that isn't working, and the finding gives us a reason to pick a particular product. And now if that reverses the finding, we believe that's a good solution. So we can test in real time, and we can bypass a lot of steps, and we can get quicker results, more specifically, and it saves the patient money. Another muscle we can test is the subscapularis, which is the opposite. It's an internal rotator. So if we push this way instead, then we're testing the subscapularis, which is related to heart. And if we give the person something that typically supports the heart, then that muscle tends to be stronger or get a lock. So again, we're not diagnosing the heart. We're not telling anyone that you have a disease or you have a heart problem. We're using the body's responses to tell us a likely product that will reverse this non-function. If we go to the latissimus, which is if we test the straight arm into the body, we pull straight out, that's testing the latissimus. And if that's not working, there's usually a relationship to the pancreas, and if we support the pancreas through a digestive enzyme, then we typically can strengthen that muscle. A lot of low back pain is due to a dysfunctional psoas, which in turn can be due to a stressed adrenal. And if we support that adrenal a little bit, not calling it a disease, but checking, does an adrenal support supplement strengthen that psoas? And then we give them some adrenal support and they come back and their back is better, then we think that that was a good idea. So when people say it doesn't work, they're questioning the validity in terms of a diagnostic function. Again, we're not diagnosing, we're using this to ask the body, we're changing the receptor input, and we're asking the body, what does it take to reverse this finding? We never diagnosed anything, we never said that you have any of these things, but we're just looking for what does the body need to improve the function. So I hope that was helpful in clearing up some confusion, because there's a lot of it out there, and a lot of it is based on lack of physiology knowledge and jumping to conclusion about the interpretation about the validity. So let me know what your experiences are. Let me know if you've had good or bad experiences, and if so, let me know what happened so we can maybe figure out if they were following these steps or not. If you want to have some fun with this, I encourage you to start playing with it. Test each other, push on some arms, hold different things, and see what changes. Just be careful. Until you have some really good skill, don't read too much into what you find, and be careful with the questions you ask. And this is especially true if you go into the emotional stuff, which I don't recommend. Once you start asking mental questions, there's a whole lot more variables and complexity and confusion and chances for false readings. So if you want to have some fun, just start playing with this. I encourage you to do this on your own, because it can be very helpful to figure out what you have, if there's some foods that your body would rather not have, or even in the grocery store if there's something that you're questioning whether you should buy or not. Once you get good at this, it can be very helpful. Until you get good though, I would encourage you to practice and be very, very careful with how you interpret what you find. Until next time, thanks for watching.